What an insightful talk from Ayu, Peter. We will be continuing our programming on Indigenous languages in Canada this afternoon with our first panel, the Inuit Language Defenders. Please submit your questions for the panelists to address at the end of their panel in the Q&A chat box. I would like to introduce our moderator and panelist for today's session. Moderating this session is Dr. Ian Martin, professor at Glendon College, York University, who will be joined by his panelists, Fiona Walton, Sandy McCauley, Derek Rasmussen, and Shelley Tulloch. Please see the session details on the agenda to view a letter submitted in 2017 to Premier Peter Tuptuna and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau on behalf of educators with extensive experience in language-related issues in Nunavut and Inuit Nunagat. Thank you and welcome to our panel.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to our panel. We are four non-Inuit language-involved academics and language rights activists who in 2017 wrote a letter, an open letter, which is posted in the website of this conference, to correct a serious lack of understanding in the legislation of the government of Nunavut on the question of language rights in education for Inuit children and youth. The four of us, and I'm going to name them in order, and they will introduce themselves. Derek Rasmussen, Shelley Tulloch, Sandy McCauley, and myself. We're among the some 24 signatories of this this open letter, and I can say that it's an example of advocacy. It was successful to a certain extent. You will be able to judge that yourselves, but please give your attention to the first of our four speakers, Derek Rasmussen. Derek, over to you.
Greetings, everyone. As Ian said, we are a group of activists concerned about the language situation in Nunavut. And although we are not Inuit, we applaud and celebrate Inuit who advocate for their language. However, we have to say they would not have to do so if we non-Indigenous people stopped trying to wipe out the Indigenous languages. Introducing myself, I'm an English-speaking white guy, and I'm here to talk about white Arctic privilege and about what white English people have done and what we're continuing to do. The word eradicate is what we're trying to do to the Inuit language in Nunavut. That's a word used by the Inuit president. And why white people ought to be the ones stopping other white people from doing harm instead of expecting Inuit to do it. And I'm not here as a representative of any organization. I'm here as an academic, and I've been studying colonial education for the last 20 years in Canada. In 1950, the Martinique poet and activist Aimé Césaire wrote that colonialism barbarizes and decivilizes the colonizer. That's many of us. I come from the colonizer class. Colonialism is not over. The majority of white bureaucrats in Nunavut are implementing a colonial agenda. They refuse to recognize and respect the culture and language that existed and continues to exist for thousands of years or more in Nunavut, and instead they continue to try to eradicate, again, the president's word, the Inuit language and culture with their latest version of Assimilation Schools 2.0. According to the Nunavut Inuit president, Luki Kutark, in Maclean's in 2018, of the 43 schools in Nunavut, all the schools operate in English except for one in Iqaluit, which operates in French. 37 out of the 42 school principals are English-speaking white people. Of the approximately 10,000 students in the system, the vast majority, around 9,300 or 9,600, are Inuit, mostly having Inuktitut as their mother tongue. There are about 90 French-speaking students and about 430 English students. In 2018, there were 452 English-speaking teachers. If you put those together, it means there were actually more English-speaking teachers in the school system in Nunavut than there were English-speaking students. Meanwhile, Canada, the Canadian government, is spending 44 times more on French inside Nunavut than on Inuktitut, about $8,000 per francophone in Nunavut, and about $186 per Inuktitut speaker. In 2008, the public government of Nunavut, and it's not an Inuit self-government, remember, it's public government like Ontario or Alberta. That government legislated the requirement to have K-12 Inuktitut language of instruction throughout the school system by 2019. But as that date approached, and they were not making that goal, there was only Inuktitut in 10 schools, and it was only optional to grade 3. The senior bureaucrats, the non-Inuit bureaucrats, panicked, and instead of trying to find a way to meet that goal, in part, in 2017, they instructed their white lawyers to write them a law to simply push back the date 10 years with no plan ever to meet the K-12 Inuit requirement for the school system. And so, as Ian said, in 2017, a group of non-Indigenous academics, that includes the people on this panel, to protest this discriminatory and harmful move, we drafted an open letter. The first draft of the letter, you'll meet the author. Fiona Walton did the first draft, and then others, including Shelley Tulloch on this panel, and Joanne Tompkins, Paul Berger, and Heather McGregor, did revisions and additions. From the time Fiona's first draft was done on March 14th of 2017 until the letter went out, as Ian said, with a couple of dozen signatures on the 16th, it had basically 3-day turnaround. It's a very fast turnaround to put out a public letter like this. I think it shows that when a bunch of people get together, they can accomplish something positive, because people feel helpless when governments and corporations do harmful things or don't do the good things that seem obvious and necessary. But instead of complaining, we can raise a collective voice, we can protest. And that's what this 2017 letter was. I believe it's linked on the site so you can read it. And as a result, the letter got coverage through Canadian press into stories throughout Southern Canada. It was also covered by the CBC and the northern papers, the Nunatsiaq News and News North. And maybe this letter, in part, played a part, maybe a small part, in the defeat of this awful law. But then the territorial government's team of non-Inuit lawyers, unfortunately, wrote an even worse law with even worse repression of Inuktitut. The new law they wrote in 2019 reduced Inuktitut from language throughout the school system, K-12, to merely one Inuit language arts course per day. They then delayed even that minimal requirement back 20 years until 2039. And Inuit parents found that if they don't force their children into these schools for at least 80% of the day, they risk having their food allowance cut. This was done to a family in Sanikiluaq in 2018. By the way, this 2019 law didn't include any input from the 200 pages of suggestions for improvement that were collected during consultations on the previous law, 2017. So we might ask, why pretend to do consultations at all? Kunuk Inutuk, Nunavut's languages commissioner, told the United Nations back in 2016 that Inuit were losing their language at approximately 12% per decade. That means by the time this delayed goal comes into place in 2039, Maybe only 15% of Inuit will be using Inuktitut at home. Raphael Lemkin, the Polish lawyer who pioneered the UN Convention on Genocide, first coined that word in a book he wrote in 1944. And on the same page where he coined the word, he said, genocide has two phases. First, the destruction of the national pattern of an oppressed group, and then the imposition of the national pattern of the oppressor. Canada and its subordinate territorial government, which Canada legislates and directs, are attempting to destroy the national pattern of Inuit in Nunavut and replace it with an English pattern, the pattern of the oppressor. This fits Lemkin's definition of genocide. Prime Minister Mulroney's cabinet wrote a secret memo in 1990 forbidding Nunavut from having any protection for the Inuit language in its school system or its legal system. This is not an accident. This is a deliberate action by Canada's cabinet to block the use of the Inuit language in Nunavut. This instruction has never been rescinded. To this day, the Trudeau cabinet has never countermanded this order. Why? So that short-term, fly-in, fly-out white people can work in English in Iqaluit, mostly, the capital of Nunavut, for a short while. And then they fly home. Most of the Inuit in Nunavut don't stay long, 2 years. For them, it's almost a suburb of Ottawa. Settler, which gets a lot, would almost be a compliment because almost no white people actually settle for any long term in Nunavut. Go check the cemetery. There are less than a dozen white people buried there. What we see in Nunavut is a bizarre form of internal colonialism that makes a few non-Indigenous Canadians a lot of money. According to the 2016 census, the median income for about 4,000 white in Nunavut was over $100,000. What was the median income for the 19,000 Inuit? $22,000. And 80,000 between Inuit and whites. As far as I know, that's the largest gap between two ethnicities anywhere in the country. You'd think that would be a front page story in every newspaper, but as far as I know, nobody blinks an eye about this. The result is that the 85% Inuit majority in Nunavut get essential services in their own language. Meanwhile, the 75% of the government's middle and senior managers are white people speaking English. They write the briefing notes, they write the laws, and they then tell Inuit politicians what they can and cannot do. They use language law to put the systemic in racism. The hospitals and all the medical clinics run in English. Inuktitut speakers have died in the medical system because unilingual health workers who speak English can't Inuit. The cops, the courts, the corrections. When last surveyed, only 11 out of 142 RCMP in Nunavut are Inuit. CBC called it the least racially representative police force in any Canadian jurisdiction. The police have to get bystanders to translate for them because they can't understand the locals. Nunavut has 2/3 of Canada's coastline, but you can't call the Coast Guard and speak to them in Inuktitut. On February 6th of this month, in the House of Commons, in a committee, the Nunavut MP, Lori Idlout, asked the Heritage Minister, Pablo Rodriguez, since Canada paid for the buildings and staff for 13 residential schools in Nunavut to eradicate the Inuit culture and language from 1951 to 1997, will Canada pay to build and staff 13 Inuktitut schools in Nunavut to restore and support Inuit culture and language for 46 years? The minister admitted that what was done to Inuit was horrific, a horrible injustice. But he said, building schools is not my department, and he shuffled the blame. This is what a Canadian-run genocide looks like. Nice white people speaking nice, polite English, trying to eradicate a 1,000-year-old culture. Now, there are over 1 million students at Canadian universities and about 50,000 professors. We on this panel are a few university people who've written a couple of open letters. You can see the link to the one from 2017 and the one to 2019. But so much more could be done. Since it's our government doing the colonizing, every student ought to be doing their school essays on this and protesting and saying, don't colonize in our name. We have to realize colonization is not over. It's still going on, and we ought to be trying to stop it. At a minimum, we must demand our government give Inuit in Nunavut the same language rights as the English and French have in Nunavut. That's the absolute least we can do. We've spent decades trying to wipe out their language. The least we can do is try to build the same number of schools to teach the language as we built to destroy it. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Derek. A wonderful talk, and I'm looking forward to the question and answer period after the panel completes our 4 presentations. The next speaker is Shelley Tulloch from the University of Manitoba. And can we see Shelley up on the screen? Yes. Hello, Shelley. It's all yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. Some of my favorite language advocates are Inuit youth. And I want to start by reflecting back on what they said in their 2005 report of the Inuit Circumpolar Youth Council, where they wrote, "Laws are a place to make things possible, but people make things happen." I'm going to build on what Ayu and Derek have said by exploring voice, choice, and agency, and limits on these. In other words, power, in the development and implementation of language in education policies. I'll organize my thoughts around 3 main questions. Where do we see agency in Inuit language policy and planning? How does context limit or shape Inuit agency? And how can we, as Canadians from all walks of life, be part of creating a more just linguistic reality in Inuit Nunangat and for all Canadians? I'll admit I'm a bit uncomfortable speaking about language advocacy in Canada. I'm aware that as a white, Anglo, middle-class, educated, Christian, abled Canadian, I belong to the group that is responsible for the erasure and silencing of everything but English. As Ayu said, we all need to work together. And as Derek said, I believe that people who look like us and talk like us need to be talking to each other so that we can support what Inuit like Ayu and like the Inuit Circumpolar Youth Council are saying and doing. So I'm sharing from the perspective of what I've heard, listening to and working with Inuit in language policy and planning over the past 20-ish years. And many of my thoughts are from a chapter that I co-wrote with retired educator and Inuit policymaker Naudlak Anahuk back in 2018. So where do we see Inuit agency in Inuit language policy and planning? I define agency as the capacity, intent, action, and impact to achieve desired ends, building on Tolson, 1991. At the macro level, all of the Inuit land claims have included recognition of Inuit rights to shape Inuit language and Inuit education for their children and for their communities. The 1975 James Bay Northern Quebec Agreement wrote it straight into the land claim that Inuit children would be educated in Inuktitut. So arguably this is protected under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms as part of treaty and land claim rights. The 1993 Nunavut Act says the Nunavut government has the right to legislate in areas of language and education, and it has. At the middle level, or what Baldoff calls the meso level of language policy and planning, organizations like Nunavut Tungavik Incorporated, Inuit Circumpolar Youth Council, Ilitaksanak, the Nunavut Literacy Council, Pirovik, where IU works, and others are advocating for and opening spaces and delivering programs that increase knowledge and use of Inuktitut. And at the macro or micro level, individuals like principals, teachers, parents, kids are making decisions about how they use language, when and where, and behaving in ways that open up or close spaces for language learning and use. As Shohami argued theoretically, and as ICYC observed in practice, it's people who make things happen, or not, sometimes regardless of the overarching government initiatives. Indigenous scholars see that Indigenous languages have persisted despite state power that dictated their annihilation due to local level, individual resistance of parents, kids, teachers, and others. And on the flip side, we see that even where there was protective legislation for Inuktitut, such as Nunavut's First Education Act, or Nunavik's strong land claims entrenched language of education policy, sometimes the language continues to be marginalized. And I believe this reflects ideological and discursive power that limits Inuit agency, including individual beliefs, attitudes, choices, and actions. How does context limit or shape Inuit agency? I believe that what planning is symptomatic of and embedded in the broader processes of colonization and decolonization. Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission found that colonialism remains an ongoing process, shaping both the structure and the quality of the relationship between the settlers and Indigenous peoples. And that's a direct quote from the final report. Indigenous scholar Marie Baptiste defines colonization as a system of oppression, social and political, that creates cognitive imperialism. This is the belief that the colonizer's ways are superior, implicitly accepted by the colonizer and the colonized. This includes the normativization of English, of monolingualism, as white Canadians as the ones generating and communicating knowledge, etc. As just one example, we see the colonial undertones in the terms of reference that guided Ian Martin's 2000 Language of Instruction report for the government of Nunavut. He was asked to address the so-called, and I'm quoting from the terms of reference, long-standing debate between those who believe that Inuit will succeed when the school system truly reflects the culture, and those who feel that the lack of academic achievement is language-based and that more instruction in English is needed. This so-called tension is still talked about across the Inuit homeland, presented as an either-or. But of course, you can do both. Teach English more effectively and have a language and culture-based education system. We also see the ongoing colonial context in teachers who still tell their students not to talk Inuktitut to each other because the teacher doesn't understand, in principals who decide to ignore language of education policies because their kid is in the school and they want them educated in English, or because it's just not their priority, in parents who self-select to send their kids to English programs because they're told that it's the Inuktitut language teaching that is contributing to their child's struggle in school. We see it in the graduates of the Nunavut Masters of Education program that Sandy will talk about next, who wrote many of their graduate papers on the subject of colonization and its impact on their journeys as educational leaders. Although Inuit have obtained power to legislate language in education, the teachers and leaders' experiences suggest that karlunat, which Zebedee Nungat calls a mentality and a behavior as much as a skin color or language, still disproportionately control discursive and ideological power, including whose perspectives are heard, whose ideas are implemented, which work is rewarded. In these ways, Inuit agency continues to be undermined. So how can we as Canadians from all walks of life be part of creating a more just linguistic reality? Marie Baptiste points out that language policy and planning is a tool towards rebalancing power and relationships in the neo-colonial context. And Maori scholar Graham Smith says decolonizing is an iterative process through which we build critical awareness, resist colonial thoughts and practices, and adopt transformative actions. I absolutely respect Inuit sovereignty in language and in education, and I come from a place of recognizing Inuit leadership. And I think that there's still a lot that people who look like me and talk like me can and must do to support what they're doing. We can stand behind MPs like Laurie Edlout that Derek talked about. We can write to our own MPs and tell them that we support federal funding for language initiatives that Indigenous people are asking for and that Indigenous people know will work. We can become critically aware of our own complicity in ongoing language erasure, in limiting or opening agent of spaces, and let that awareness change our practice. The hegemony of English and monolingualism is just one example, and we can do small things to disrupt that. For example, by getting really comfortable having people around us speaking other, even laughing as they do, by using other languages and being part of a national movement that rejects the hegemony of English and that silences other languages. Learning an Indigenous language so that the people that we work with don't need to switch to English to accommodate us. Amplifying Inuit voices, taking the opportunity to listen to documentaries, to pre-recorded Inuit videos, to talk with Inuit face-to-face. Listen and repeat what we hear to people who may never have the opportunity or make the choice to listen to Inuit advocating. In these ways, we can be part of opening up ideological and discursive spaces and be less complicit in silencing other languages. We can also use our platforms to attack limiting content. Sandy will talk next about the Nunavut Masters of Education program that did that. And if we have time at the end, I would love to tell you about an initiative at the University of Winnipeg that is also working on creating and opening spaces for effective teaching and learning of Indigenous languages.
Thanks very much, Shelley. Manusakut. My portion of the talk is going to share examples of the potential of personal and institutional collaborations to create the kind of spaces that are needed for Inuit educational empowerment, and particularly through graduate programs that were offered in collaboration with the Government of Nunavut and the University of Prince Edward Island. Ian and Shelley were both involved in various ways in those initiatives. I'm just going to call up my slides here if I can. There we go. I come to this presentation as a Khadana who worked as a teacher and a teacher consultant in what is now Nunavut from 1982 to 1997. And one of the first things I realized on arrival in Iqaluit, it was called Frobisher Bay then, was that despite having the sketchiest knowledge of Inuit language and culture, I had far greater benefits in terms of a secure, well-paid, respected career than they did. Derek's already referred to that, and that hasn't changed very much. Fortunately, though, at that time, I also had some various opportunities to act to maybe alleviate that somewhat. I had an initial initiation for educators new to the North. It was taught in collaboration with long-term Northerners, white, but also with Inuit instructors. We learned basic language, and we learned some very straightforward things about not to do going as a Kadanak into a classroom. There were a number of evening adult education programs in Inuit language and culture that were offered that we could take. They were free of charge. I remember going to Inuit classes in the evening. I remember Paul Kwasa doing a wonderful presentation on Inuit humor, but also on his winning the first election in Igloolik that he participated in. Finally, and perhaps most important, was the growing support in the 1980s for, whoops, got the right, yes, whoops, I went too far, apologies. There was support for local Inuit control of education through the development of local education authorities. And it was promoted, and there was a consultation. People did listen to it. People did act on it, and it resulted in the creation of boards of education across the Northwest Territories, and especially the Eastern Arctic. The Baffin Divisional Board of Education in Iqaluit was the board that I worked for, and it was the first divisional board of education in the Northwest Territories. I'm going to talk about two major initiatives that took place and where they came from, because part of this is about listening to people and what they say, and part, I just appreciated Shelley's point about action and impact. And people listened and people acted, and I like to believe we had some kind of impact. In the, I'm going to give you an introduction to the Nunavut Master of Education. In the early 1990s, the Nunavut, the boards of education that were going to become part of Nunavut launched a Northern Territorial wide survey of all Inuit educators at the K-12 level in the three regions that would become Nunavut in 1999. They were to determine the needs of the educators in the territory to make an Inuit-controlled system of education, and to determine particularly what was needed to raise the status of Inuit educators from lower in the educational hierarchy to higher and taking more responsibility. So in particular, it highlighted the need for educational opportunities for Inuit. I was a part of a small research project with Fiona Walton and Joanne Tompkins, which interviewed in 2004 or so, 4 experienced Inuit educators on their perceptions of what had happened to education in Nunavut in the 4 or 5 years after the new territory was created. 2 quotes stick in my mind almost 20 years later. The first one was a principal who was the longest serving Inuit principal in the territory said, and I'm paraphrasing, but since the creation of Nunavut, education has gone back 50 years, i.e. to the time that Derek talked about when the federal day schools came in. Another very well-respected and long-term Inuit educator noted that no matter how much Inuit did, they never seemed to gain the same status as the white teachers like me who came in from the South and knew nothing. There was always one more hurdle they had to rise above in order to get anywhere, and even that didn't seem high enough. And finally, there's a story that Fiona likes to tell, is getting on the plane after this focus group research study and another respected Inuit educator came up to her at the airport and said, "Fiona, take this back to UPEI and get us a master's program." One of the things that's possible in a small university is that you have the support, you can get things done. And so Fiona was primarily because of Fiona's drive and the support from key people, a very few key people in the government of Nunavut. We ran 2 Inuit Master of Education, Nunavut Master of Education programs. And I'll just point out, I don't know if you can see that at the top of the screen and the slide is the first graduating class in 2006 from the Nunavut MEd. At the bottom right is the second graduating class. I believe, Ian, this is the course that you co-taught in Rankin Inlet in the first Master of Education. And you'll notice that it's being co-taught by an elder, and there's a young person in the room observing. The middle right photograph comes from one of the courses I taught as students were getting ready to prepare for their Keystone, Capstone research project at the end of finish the program. Over well, there were 2 offerings of the program, 2 iterations, which graduated a total of 36 Inuit women in 2006 to 2009 and 2010 to 2013, so 7 years. The program consisted of 10 courses. 8 of the 10 courses were taught in 2-week face-to-face sessions, modules in Nunavut. And incidentally, that's one of the recommendations that came out of the report that I first mentioned initially, done by the Nunavut Boards of Education. And like I said, as a capstone project, the students designed and executed local education research projects, which were presented at a symposium at the end of the program. As one student put it in her one of her summaries as they were working together was, "We are building a critical voice together." I haven't listed it in the references, but there was actually a book available, I think, through Scholars Press, which summarizes, which it doesn't summarize, it has 10 of the presentations made by Inuit from various of the programs. They're really worth reading. Another just short story that I'll mention is one of the instructors of the first courses in the Nunavut Master of Education, teaches at St. FX, Joanne Tompkins, and she was approached by a young man from Nunavut who was a Habanak white man, who was saying, well, he heard that there was going to be a Nunavut Master of Education, but he really wanted to take the 1A, the program at St. FX because it would be a real master's. Joanne was happy to inform him that she had taught the program in Nunavut, and she was going to be teaching him in this course as well. I think that's shut him up for a bit. The success, the Nunavut education program, the MEd program, ended partly because it was hugely expensive and partly because there were key personnel that left the government of Nunavut to support it. But what happened was it evolved into the Certificate for Educational Leadership in Nunavut, which was building on the existing principal certification program, which all principals had to take, but really had no academic credibility whatsoever. So it was very much like the orientation program that I took when I started. I could have forgotten that after my first 2 weeks of teaching, had I chosen. There would be no incentive to go beyond that other than what I brought with me. So what the collaboration with UPEI did was take these 2 courses and build them into a structure for the CELN, which would give, and I'm just going to switch the slide here, not that there's much to show on this one, which would give which would give a structure to the program that would give post-secondary recognition for the graduates of the program and allow them to achieve advanced credit in courses for a Master of Education at UPEI or probably any other university because they were UPEI recognized courses. All courses in the CELN were taught by instructors with successful experience in Nunavut, teaching and working in Nunavut, and supported participants working in English or Inuktitut. So participants had the choice of what language they could use for their assignments and so on. And that meant a certain amount of scrambling, given that most of the teachers were Khadanag. What happened, though, is that also graduates from the Nunavut MEd, because they had their MEds, were qualified to teach in these courses. And so there was a repurposing, if you wish, of their skills and talents and the authority of their credentials to create a by-your-bootstraps sort of environment. There was one course that I had the privilege of being able to sit in on, which was the first fully Inuktitut program as part of the CELN. And a long-term Inuit educator that I'd known for years and years said to me, Sandy, it was having this course in Inuktitut that gave me the confidence to think that I could be an administrator in Nunavut schools as well. So just to refer to the three main design principles behind this program was the partnership between the GN and the department, the Faculty of Education at UPEI. The UPEI provided the academic integrity, which Joanne's student had questioned earlier on, and that it was designed to be delivered in Nunavut to support Nunavut educators. Unfortunately, and I'm not going to dwell on reasons why the partnership with UPEI ended. I have some reasons of my own that I won't mention here, but it reminds me very much of something that happened to me about my third year teaching. I read a book by Hugh Brody, who was an anthropologist who had gone to live in Pond Inlet, Mitamatilik, and he wrote a chapter on education. I went down to talk to my principal, and I said, Malcolm, I've got to resign. I've just read The People's Land, and I can't teach here anymore. And he said, Sandy, I read the same book when I was about your stage in my teaching career, and I almost resigned too. And I realized if I resign and leave, they'll hire somebody else from the South, and they'll have to learn it all over again. So in closing, I just want to point out that there is potential, despite all the negative things that happened, despite the systemic structures, and some of it's not, I suppose the worst part of it is not intentional. It's just the way it happens. If you're part of the dominant group, you don't think about what the other members of the group are doing, or that you have a responsibility. So what we tried to do was create collaborative institutional partnerships, create spaces for Inuit educators to develop their academic qualifications in their own language, rooted in their own culture. They were challenging in terms of cost, human effort, and ongoing institutional support. And in closing, I would say they require, and I think the message I'm taking from this panel is that they require unwavering vision on part of all involved students, instructors, and administrators. And there are people out there who believe in it and are willing to act on it. Pianik.
This is Ian Martin speaking. Does anyone hear me? Am I muted, or am I live? Okay, well, I'll go ahead. I'm actually on myself. I'm afraid I'm not able to use my laptop, but anyway, here. So you've heard from Derek, Shelley, and Sandy about the circumstances in which the 2017 open letter was a reaction. It's being presented, after all, a language rights conference, especially on Language Advocacy Day. In the history of advocacy for Inuit language rights in Nunavut, the one territory the Inuit are in the majority. In fact, the same proportion. The Inuit in Nunavut is comparable to the proportion of francophones in Quebec. And language rights in Quebec and those in Nunavut couldn't be greater. A case of linguistic discrimination in Canada, reflecting PAC has called a hierarchy of belonging. Language activists have to do whatever is necessary to illustrate discrimination and linguistic hierarchies from the face of the country. Our home on native land. The advocacy of Inuit language rights in Nunavut is a special case of advocacy, though, unlike the cases of advocacy which many of the audience are engaged in. After all, advocacy within an existing legislative context. Context of rights. However unimplemented they may be, they are rights, and the jump from rights on paper to real right of my conversation. The government of Nunavut, it's true, had significant, long advocated language legislation in 2000, an Official Languages Act of Nunavut, the Inuit Language Protection Act, the education pointed to full, strong bilingual education in the territory by 2000. It never happened. But her letter addressed a legislature in 2017 that wished to amend rights that a previous legislature had implemented. Well, had declared. In other words, we advocates are working, or were working inside the room of the legislation. But the only legislation at the time that we were working with was federal legislation. At the time, there was no federal legislation which we, the advocates, could win our argument. Now, in 2023, things may be different. The environment of Canada is more favorable. In 2019, responding to the new environment explosive report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2015, and to a very effort in favor of federal government response to the calls of action 13, 14, and 15, the Indigenous Languages Act of 2019. But very notably, the Indigenous Languages Act, cold. None of their demands were met in that law.
Unfortunately, we seem to have lost Ian. Hopefully he's going to jump back on. But in the meantime, maybe Sandy and I could, and Derek, hopefully you're still there, can address some of the questions. So the first question that came through was, how can people outside of Nunavut connect with their local MPP's representatives on this issue? And Derek, if you're there, I think you're better at this question than I am. So please jump in and interrupt me. But I'll start in the meantime. If you go to, you can Google who is my MP, or you could go to ourcommons.ca, and there's a search engine there that you type in your postal code. It will tell you who your MP is. If you click on that MP, it will give you all of their contact information. And what I'm suggesting is that we need many MPs from right across Canada standing up to support people like Lori Idlaut, who are putting forth arguments for Inuit. So I can write to my MP here in Winnipeg. You can write to your MPs wherever you are and let them know that this is something that Canadians across the country care about. It's not just an Inuit or an Indigenous question. Derek, do you want, or Sandy, do you want to add to that?
Hi, I would add, yeah, that you could also link, if you're writing to your MP, you could link to President Kuturk's article in Maclean, send a link to that along. The 2018 article, which is a very forceful article that encompasses all the issues in one place. I think she expresses the issues really well and encapsulates the unfairness between the situation themselves, where they are the majority in Nunavut, and any of the rights English and French have. And she explains it well. That is a pithy, short way of putting a message across if you're not sure exactly how to express it in your communication with your member of parliament. That's all I would add.
Shelley, I have a question here from somebody who was asking about resources to learning in Southern Canada. I have about 4 or 5 books here that I can hold up to the screen, but I can't take images and post them right now. But I'll find out from Ian or somebody how to do that. Incidentally, most of these are produced by the company with which IUS works with, Piruvik. So there's Inuktitut Essentials. Is it coming backwards to you too? Pigiarovik. So it's South Baffin language in the old terms. There's a reference grammar. But you'd be able to find more out about these directly from Piruvik, and I'll put the URL in.
I believe also the Inuit associations in Ottawa and Toronto offer programs, perhaps in Winnipeg too, but I know the ones, the urban Inuit organizations in Ottawa and Toronto also offer language programming. Also for children, I know there is, for example, in Ottawa, there's a van pickup service for children in the Ottawa area to take them to Inuktitut daycare. So the organizations in Ottawa and Toronto are helping on Inuktitut in those.
Yeah, Avatak in Montreal also has offered Inuktitut programming at some points. I don't know if it's still doing that. The Pirovic that Sandy mentioned also has really excellent online learning for Inuktitut. That website is tusalanga.ca, and I don't think you can. I don't think that you can see my chat, but it's TUSAALANGA, Tusalanga. So if you Google that or go to pirovic.ca/Tusalanga, there are online courses with really great audio and really great setup. If you Google Mieli Elise Coley, also, she is a teacher who does online teaching of Inuktitut live. Mieli Coley, Coley. So those are some options for learning Inuktitut. I know I would love to have it at University of Winnipeg too, and if we get enough demand, we have the course on the books that we can offer, and I think there are a few other universities that have it on the books if there's enough demand.
And I would add, in terms of advocacy with your members of Shelley covered well how to contact them and so on. I think for those of us who have some familiarity with social media or use social media frequently, it's a good idea to put the message out on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and talk about the situation, because there's a lot of misunderstanding about what's going on in Nunavut and there in terms of the language unfairness there. And there's much that could be done through the standard social media channels that we all have access to that I think there hasn't been a lot of exposure there yet about the issues, language issues in Nunavut.
Yeah, well, I think that we're at time, so I'll thank the audience for your questions and for your attention. And thank you to Ian, who unfortunately got knocked off this call, for putting together this panel, to Language Advocacy Day 23 for inviting us. And Sandy and Derek, it's great to see you again and to have this conversation. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.